Oh, goody.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So in this one, I wanted to take a look at what I think are the top 5 decks for this most recent season, the Quantum Realm. We are just a handful of days away from the next season starting up, and the meta is fairly settled at this point after all the different developments from the new cards, buffs, nerfs, etc. So I wanted to go over the 5 best decks in the game right now. So if you're trying to make one final push to Infinite or whatever rank you're going for this season, you have kind of an idea of what decks are good to use or what decks are good to kind of work towards if you don't have these cards. Also, I will be doing a little bit bonus segment at the end with some kind of starter pool 3 only versions to get you started, as unfortunately a lot of these decks do use pool 4 and pool 5 cards. But if you're looking for budget stuff, stay tuned to the end, we'll cover that. But these are going to be the 5 best decks in Marvel Snap for the February season. And starting off, we have the big purple elephant in the room, Thanos. Thanos, just probably without a doubt the best deck in the game right now. It's just so versatile and ridiculous, and it's just not something that has been able to be effectively countered. And the big reason for that, there are 2 kind of culprits here. Leech, which is able to kind of shut off your opponent's hand so they can't really interact with the big stuff you're doing, and Lockjaw. Lockjaw, when in combination with all these stones that Thanos gives us, allows us to cheat a ridiculous amount of stuff into play. If you look at the mana curve of this deck, we have 2 cheap things in Sunspot and Quinjet. Obviously the stones are in here too. But then all the other stuff, we have Jaws are only 3, Shang-Chi has some interaction for our 4, and then everything else in this deck is 5 cost or more. Blue Marvel, Devil Dino, Arrow, all these 6 drops. It's kind of crazy how a deck with this kind of curve can actually work, and the big reason for it is Lockjaw. The biggest tip about this deck is actually harder to play than I think a lot of people give it credit for, but the biggest tip you can learn with this deck is if you have Lockjaw and a few stones to toss into it in hand, it's usually pretty safe to snap. And the reason why this deck hasn't been able to be effectively countered is because not only is it mana cheating a bunch of big stuff into play usually with Lockjaw, but also it's mana cheating with Leech. And that's the whole thing with Leech here, is Leech was balanced by the fact that it was a big tempo loss. But because of all the basically mana cheating we're doing in this deck, Leech is no longer really a tempo loss because you're either cheating it out a turn early with the Time Stone, it's coming out of Lockjaw for free, or you're throwing it into Lockjaw so you get the powerful effect, and then you have a good chance of a big card coming out to replace it. The devs have actually said Leech is on their kind of watch list, so we'll have to stay tuned to that. But most players, myself included, think this is the best deck in the game right now, bar none. And I would not be surprised if it is a deck that gets knocked down a peg in the next balance changes. I think if they're going to target something here, it's probably going to be Lockjaw or Leech. But even if they do adjust this in the not too distant future, I do think Thanos is still going to remain a very powerful and high tier deck. It's just really, really good. And if you have Thanos, you really can't go wrong with this one. Next up is the second most popular and probably the second best deck in the game, and that is Shuri Red Skull. So Shuri has just really kind of encouraged this big point slam meta, because it turns out when you use Shuri to make your Red Skull a 5 cost 30 power, and then are able to copy it with either Taskmaster or Zola, it gets pretty busted pretty quickly. And this deck has a bunch of tools to prevent you from interacting with their big target, because they have armor and they have Cosmo to turn off the Shang-Chi that would normally kind of serve as the answer to this Red Skull. So Shuri's a deck where if they have kind of their nuts curve, where they have a good 1-drop into a way to protect their big thing, into Shuri, into big thing, and then they usually finish up the game with either copying it with either of these cards. They can finish up with arrowing you if they have priority and they're winning 2 lanes, and then She-Hulk just gives them another big Shuri target. This is also another thing where they can go Shuri on 4 into pass into 20 power She-Hulk and Taskmaster on 6. So this deck is just very versatile, very powerful, There are other versions of it. I know the Sauron version apparently has a rather good win rate, but I really do think in this meta you more so value things like Cosmo and Armor, because Shang-Chi is in almost every deck in the game. I know not everyone's super huge on Zola, but the thing I love about Zola here is that it basically makes it very hard for your opponent to know if they can actually Shang-Chi your thing. The reality is we're not always going to get the ways of protecting our big thing. So this actually can be a way to protect it from a Shang-Chi if we have priority, because we just get to pop it into 2 other lanes and then their Shang-Chi really doesn't do anything. Arrow is also a big one for the deck, being able to move their Shang-Chi out of the way if you have priority. Very helpful for the deck, though I will say, if Arrow is a card that gets adjusted in the future, I will be very scared of Shuri if it is also not adjusted in some way, as I think Arrow helps counter the Shuri decks often more than they really benefit from her. But yeah, Shuri, very, very powerful deck, a little bit more budget friendly, because Shuri is the only pool 4 card here. Everything else is pool 3 or below. Definitely one that's very linear, but when you have the good cards in the deck, and there are a lot of good cards in this deck, you curve out pretty reasonably, and it can just be very hard for your opponent to be able to effectively interact with you. Next up, we have another big bad here in Galactus. So I've seen a ton of people get to Infinite this month with Galactus, and I've played a decent amount of it myself, and I've been rather impressed with how well it seems to be doing in the current environment. Obviously, Galactus is more of a combo deck, and it does have some popular counters such as Arrow or other ways of moving cards. So our Galactus gets something else in its lane, and then we're kind of sad. But even though it has a lower cube average you're getting per game, you're often only getting a cube or 2 most of the time. Those 4 or 8 cube wins are a little bit more rare. It just wins enough that the cubes add up, and it's actually a surprisingly viable deck for climbing the ladder. Now, this is the version of Galactus I've really liked a lot. There are a lot of different versions of Galactus out there, but I do feel pretty confident in saying that Null is the better, if not best, version of Galactus. Though I know not everyone's going to have this card, I have recommended Destroyer as a replacement, as that card can do some pretty powerful things as well. But if you have it, Null is just kind of the way to go. Really gives us another big way to win the game outside of Death, who is also one of the other ways that we're trying to win the game. Big thing with Galactus that you really need to know is you want to basically be stacking 1 lane with all your cheap stuff here, your early game, and that way you can't get arrowed. Daredevil also helps with this a bit, so we kind of know what they're doing on turn 5. We know if they're going to counter us, so this really kind of helps with our cube equity. You need 2 pieces of ramp. We opt for Electro and Psylocke here. You could do Wave if you do not have one of these, but I do personally like these 2 the most. A lot of people ask about Yellow Jacket. Yellow Jacket is here for 2 main reasons. He is here to pair with Adam Warlock to help us draw cards in the early game, as this deck oftentimes really needs Galactus to win. It's possible to win without it, but it's usually very hard. So Yellow Jacket, not only does it help us get a draw with Adam Warlock to get our win condition, but it's also just another body that can die to the Galactus to make our death even cheaper, which sometimes can be relevant. Then the other cards here that are pretty important. So Doc Ock, really, really nice card. If we do happen to Galactus on turn 4, which isn't as common with this deck with that wave, but it does happen sometimes, this is just really, really good for being able to just pull their stuff. Or we can do this on turn 4 with Electro. So we pull a bunch of stuff out of their hand, and then we blow up that lane with Galactus the following turn. Usually makes our Null very big and our Death very cheap, as well as getting rid of some key cards. And then Shang-Chi is our other big win condition here, because if our opponent has priority, a lot of times they're going to slam a big thing. So either if we don't have a big thing to slam, or if we only have Death as one of our big things and we're worried it's not enough, we can just slam our Shang-Chi, slam Death, usually blow up their big thing and win the game. The biggest thing about Galactus is managing your priority. Every time you can, you want to make it so that Galactus does not give you priority on the final turn. So you want your opponent to be winning that lane, having at least 3 power or more there, because we'll only have 2 with Galactus. And then Chavez is just very important for deck consistency. We are a combo deck. Galactus is how we win the majority of our games, so guaranteeing that we have a higher chance to see it and our important ramp cards early on in the game is very important. Next up here, we have Devil Dinosaur Darkhawk. So Devil Dinosaur continues to be a very powerful card in Archetype, though I do think it has taken a little bit of a hit due to the popularity of Shang-Chi around, since all the big decks in the format have just big Shang-Chi-able targets. But I do think this deck is still pretty solid. Darkhawk, even though he got hit with that little bit of a nerf, still a very, very good card. And even a little bit better with all the Thanos running around, though unfortunately the Thanos, if they do get their Lockjaw, can really churn through their deck pretty quickly. But we do have ways of putting bad stuff in their deck, such as Korg and our Rock Slide here, to not only grow the Darkhawk, but make their draws worse, or hopefully make their Lockjaw low roll. Other than that, we just have a lot of good Dino cards here, Sentinel and White Queen to keep our hand nice and big. Moon Girl enables us to be able to double up on some of our powerful cards like Darkhawk, like Rock Slide, like Dino, even Arrow sometimes. Zabu's really good in this list because being able to play Zabu lets us play a Rock Slide or a Moon Girl or a White Queen on turn 3, which is pretty powerful tempo. Armor is, or Shang-Chi is everywhere, so armor is absolutely required here because we do need ways to protect our big stuff. Quinjet, real nice because we're going to be generating cards to hand, whether it be Sentinel, Moon Girl, or White Queen. So getting those cards even cheaper is very nice. And then Mystique is pretty good because we have multiple targets for it in the deck, mainly being Darkhawk and Devil Dino, which both really get pretty big. And then Arrow here, Arrow's just Arrow. She's still really, really good though. The popularity of Thanos, I think, is actually making Arrow a little bit worse than she typically is because they kind of clog up their board a bit, but she's still the more worth to include. Dino, definitely a bit of a trickier one because you have to be very mindful about playing around Shang-Chi due to all your big things, but it can definitely be a solid deck to climb in the current meta. The last deck here on our list, one of my favorite decks in the game, is Sarah Control, and this is the deck I used for a lot of my climb from 90 to 100 this month. Just kind of old, reliable here, very, very solid deck, and it's a very reactive deck. So what we're trying to do here is we are trying to be able to do some powerful things on the final turn, really big swings, like blowing up their big thing or taking down a dinosaur or other powerful ongoing effect, as well as blowing up our Nova with Killmonger. We'll have spread out a decent amount of bodies on the board, so this is actually a pretty big buff to our board. And then we also just have some good tech inclusions here, like Scarlet Witch to help get rid of a not optimal location. Bishop really benefits from the fact that we're playing a lot of cards, especially with Mysterio. Mysterio is pretty nice because he makes it so we don't always get priority, which sometimes we do not want, and also has some good mind games versus the opponent and more bodies for the Nova. Blizzard, just a really good 2-drop. Sentinel, rather nice because sometimes we have a handful of tech cards and we don't want to play any of them yet, so this always kind of guarantees we're going to have something to do in the early game. Maximus, bit of a flex slot. I like the extra stats from him, but you could definitely run other 3-drops in the place. But I do like him in this deck, especially playing him on the final turn, because then the downside doesn't really matter. And with all the Thanos running around, a lot of opponents usually have pretty full hands anyway, so the downside isn't as much of one as it usually is right now. But really fun reactive deck. Zabu here, common question I get is 2 4-drops enough with Zabu, and it is. The main reason we have Zabu here is it enables more consistency for making our powerful tech swing cards 3 cost, which is a huge difference, especially when we don't draw our Sarah. And then if we do draw our Sarah, then they're only costing 2, and anyone who played when Zabu was unnerfed knows how ridiculous it is when these powerful 4-cost tech cards only cost 2 mana. Now there is another version of this list. It's the same kind of core, but it has a little bit of a different package to it. So this is Toxic Sarah. As you can see, we have a lot of overlap to the Sarah control deck, and it very much is a control deck in its own right, but it does a little bit different here. Luke Cage, kind of sweet because it actually mitigates the downside of our Lizard can't be shrunk. We also get to include Typhoid Mary here as Luke Cage turns off her downside, and Enchantress can help us also more consistently remove that. And then Hazmat, a lot of stuff, especially Thanos in particular, is going wide right now, but being able to inflict all their stuff with -1 power at the end of the game and not have it hit our stuff can definitely be enough to swing a game sometimes, and people don't really see it coming. This is the build from It's Less over in the KM Best Discord, and a lot of fun, and I think definitely a very effective version of Sarah Control. I think the biggest downside to Sarah Control right now is the fact that Leech is so easily cheated out of Thanos, and this is a deck that really hates getting leeched because we're trying to have a big, impactful final turn, and we can't really do that if they shut off all the cards in our hand. So I do think this deck has a lot to gain from if they do make some changes to either Leech or Lockjaw for the Thanos deck. And then to close out the video here, I did want to showcase some more budget Pool 3 only lists for players who are still working their way through Pool 3, or players who might just be joining the game more recently rather than being around since beta or since global launch. So the 4 decks we have here, we have a pretty stock Devil Dinosaur list, we have our good cards list, we have a Red Skull list without Shuri, which actually I believe Dexter took to Infinite this month to pretty good success, and then we have a Pool 3 only version of the Sarah deck. So these are some kind of decent things to work towards, or if you have a decent Pool 3 collection, but if you're not having some of those Pool 4 or Pool 5 cards yet, this is honestly a pretty solid starting ground and can definitely help you work your way up the ladder with only Pool 3 cards. But that is going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you got something useful out of it. If you have any questions about the decks, feel free to let me know in the comments below. That's going to wrap it up for this one. If you enjoyed it, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.